It's punk rock bowling time. That's right, for the 24th year, one of the greatest festivals on earth, in my opinion, returns to downtown Las Vegas the weekend of May 25th, 26th, and 27th. I have had some of my greatest times playing this thing and just hanging out at this thing. You want to know how much this festival speaks to Turned Out a Punk's mindset? The headliners are Devo, Descendants, and Madness. Every day of this festival, the lineup is stacked with amazing bands of all types and stripes of punk and hardcore from all different eras, from ska to post-hardcore. We're talking like Bratmobile to Rock from the Crypt to Stiff Little Fingers to the Cosmic Psychos to Scowl to Chad. And then there's also all these late night after shows which are happening. And you wouldn't believe the lineup of these things, from the Zeros to Agnostic Front and everything in between. This festival is out of control for fans of punk. So I hope I will see you there, because this isn't like some sort of festival that you just go to and the bands are secluded in some sort of backstage area. Bands and fans and just punks alike are all just taking over downtown Las Vegas. So you turn around and all of a sudden you're gambling beside John Doe from X. I don't know if John Doe gambles, but if you turn around on the buffet line, you'll probably see me. And you better believe we're going to be talking about punk music. And because this festival loves this podcast as much as this podcast loves this festival, Punk Rock Bowling is bringing you a series of special episodes. So each and every week, I will have an episode going up featuring someone that's playing this festival. And hot damn, are there some good ones coming. Head over to punkrockbowling.com and hopefully I see you in downtown Las Vegas, May 25th, 26th, and 27th. Hello and welcome to another edition of Turned Out a Punk. I'm your host, Damian Abraham, and once again I'm bringing you a conversation with someone who grew up listening to punk, may or may not still be involved with punk, but had their life changed by the genre in a major way. And today on the show, not one, not two, but three punk rock legends are returning to the show today. Currently all playing together in Me First and the Gimme Gimmes, but you may also know them from their bands Rock from the Crypt, the Ramones, Hot Snakes, Drive Like Jehu, the Swingin Utters. We could just spend the next little bit listing off some bands here, but instead we want to get to you hearing the return of John Reis, Spike Slawson, and coming back to the show, giving me a chance for a mulligan on the greatest fumble I ever had in Turned Out Punk history. I might have mixed my sports metaphors there. I don't know too much about that stuff. CJ Ramone. Whew, this is a good one. More on that in 1 second. But first, if you want to get in touch with me, head over to the email address turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother and show producer and normally guest booker extraordinaire, Tristan Abraham, and he will get the message to me. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram at @LeftForDamian. There's a YouTube page, a TikTok page, a Facebook page, and an Instagram page, all for this podcast. All those can be found at Turned Out a Punk on those platforms. If you want to support the show, tell all your friends about it. Let them all know that you enjoy this podcast here each and every week. You can also check out the band I play in. Fuckedup.cc is the website. We are playing some shows coming up. We are going to be playing, I don't know if that's all been announced yet. We also have records. You can find out all that information over at fuckedup.cc. All right, on to today's show. Today on the show, as I said off the top, like a triumvirate of legends came over to my house to record this. We're going to call it the Northwest End of Toronto Punk Summit. That seems to work for me. 4 people, myself included, from completely different punk rock scenes, completely different experiences with this thing, all with a deep passion for it. Well, One of us is currently questioning their faith, as you'll hear on the episode. But there's a commonality in how much we think about and pontificate about this music. So this is amazing. Huge shout out to Melanie K, the homie, who you can check out her episode. She's been on the podcast before, helped organize a lot of cool things over the years, and hit me up and said, hey, these guys are in town. Do you want to come down to the show and interview them? And I have been kind of talking about this in the last few episodes, if you've been listening to me whining at the end of the show, but I've had this weird nerve injury in my legs that I've been dealing with, and I was physically just unable to make it to the show. So Melanie said, you know what? Fear not. Threw them all in the car. Eric, Toronto garage punk rock legend, Eric, her husband, drove them over here. You'll hear Eric on the show as well. And also Melanie, I think you hear Melanie talk a little bit as well in part. But they drove over to my house. And it was like a clown car of awesomeness. Not the car wasn't small, but like just all the awesomeness that came out of this car when these three dudes walked into the house. And yeah, like as I said off the top, CJ had been on before, and I had recorded this episode with him. I talk about this. You'll hear about this in a second. I don't think there's anything more for me to ramble on about. John Reis will be giving some tours at the Punk Rock Museum May 2-4 weekend. You can find out more information over at thepunkrockmuseum.com or at the Punk Rock Museum on their social medias. And speaking of John Reis, he will be putting out a new record with Swami and the Bed of Nails, which will be coming out May 15th. And Swami and the Bed of Nails, I think, are going to be doing a release show, or at least are playing a show in Las Vegas on May 24th as well at the usual place. And then, of course, Rock From The Crypt is playing as well in Vegas. I'm going to see John in Vegas. How sick is that? And speaking of new records, Me First and the Gimme Gimmes will be putting out a brand new live LP. It's coming out on Fat Records on June 14th, and it is called Me First and the Gimme Gimmes Blow It at Madison's Quinceañera. I hope I pronounced that right. We didn't have Spanish in school. Mind you, if it was in French, I wouldn't have done much better, and we definitely had that in school. So apologies for mispronouncing that. But this record's going to be amazing. This band is hilarious. As you'll hear on the show, Spike is one of the funniest people. Check out all these guys' first appearances, except for CJ's, because unfortunately we can never hear it. But don't worry, most of the greatest stuff is in this episode. So you'll hear that in a second. And that's it. Sit back, relax, and enjoy Spike, John, and CJ on Turned Out a Punk.
They're too easy to make up.
Yeah.
This is the honky tonk, man.
The blue one?
Yep, the blue one right there.
Nice.
I made a pro wrestling TV show, and so this is all the stuff that I got while I was making the show, including
And
barbed wire bat.
Stud in the white with the stars.
Yeah.
Red boots, yeah. Roddy Piper, yeah.
Yeah, this is my little corner of the house that literally no one in the family cares about but me. So I just go in here and hide sometimes.
Well, I was an 80s wrestling fan, so.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh my gosh, welcome back to the show, John, Spike, and CJ.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you. CJ, I want to start off by publicly now saying, for the record, the biggest fumble in Turn Out a Punk history was we recorded this episode, one of my favorite episodes I've ever gotten to do. And I was recording it on my iPhone, which I never did. And all of a sudden, I go home, click play, and it's gone. So I am so sorry to lose that.
Well, it gives us an opportunity to revisit all those stories that may or may not be true here.
Embellish, enhance.
Well, I feel like there's no need to do that. I think even your most boring, tame version of some of these stories is probably wilder than most of my wildest stories. But I kind of wanted to talk to you guys because one of the things that I've been, and you kind of brought this up last time and really got me thinking about it, is the idea of like joining a band where there's already an established chemistry and having to figure your way into that. And I think with Me First and the Gimme Gimmes, that's kind of like a constant thing that's going on, is new people coming in and going out. And from the outside, now it looks like you guys have an all chiller lineup. Like everyone's pretty cool and laid back. But I imagine at different times, were there like people that don't fit into the chemistry that you guys have experienced? You don't have to name names.
Yes. Definitely. Boy, yeah, I don't know if I want to name names or incidents, but yeah, there's definitely have been, including the original members. You know what I mean? Some of them that just didn't
jump. I think that was probably the
yes,
case.
Absolutely. And I was the warehouse guy. You know what I mean? So everybody kind of looked at me like that. But yeah, no, it's a really good group of people right now. Fun to travel with. Great performers. They know how to stuff a wild monkey suit.
Yeah. Jason Darcy, who plays with Bob Mould and, plays a homie. And when he was on the show, he's like, the key to being a good sideman is being a good hang. He's like, you got to know your chops. You got to do all that stuff. But anyone can do that. To be the good hang and to be the person that can kind of come into that situation and feel it out. And I use you as an example because I really do feel like if they had gotten someone else in that spot in the Ramones, I don't think they would have lasted that next little run.
Yeah. It's questionable for sure. But, it's like any relationship. You have to, like, get a feel for what you have to be able to identify the space that you can fill. With the Ramones, it was very easy for me to identify that space because nobody in the fucking band talked. Nobody talked. We'd ride in the van for hours and hours and nobody would say a word. So it was easy for me to know that I would fit perfectly to be the in-between guy. So when we were doing something like learning new songs for a record or deciding on which songs were going on a record and Johnny and Joey weren't going to talk to each other, I could be kind of the in-between guy and fill that role. And I had Johnny as my mentor and Joey I was friends with, and Mark was just a funny guy to hang around. He's the guy that made touring on the road possible. But like you're saying, you have different personalities. A lot of times they don't all gel. They don't. But a lot of times that's the fire in the band. A lot of times that's what creates the really good fiery songs or the aggressive stage performances and stuff. When I first came into the Gimmes, it was the same thing. I happened to come into the Gimmes just as the last of the original guys were kind of making their way out. So I was there to watch some complicated relationships become more complicated, which was okay for me because I had already been through it. So for me, it was just business as usual.
It's like, and you're one of the greatest front people ever, John, so I'm not taking away from you on this when I say this, but like originally Me First and the Gimme Gimmes is almost like a band of frontmen. And
yes,
that is a disaster. As a front person who's not cool like you, John, and able to adapt to different circumstances, it would be an ego storm.
And I was the mailroom person, you know what I mean? In a band full of frontmen, like, who had no compunction about asserting their prerogatives and their hierarchy. But I don't know, just it was fun. I traveled, and now it's a lot more relaxed, I would say. Wouldn't you say, CJ?
Absolutely.
Having seen the transition, it's still fun. There's still tension, and I feel like there's still energy that we can draw on for live performances. But we can actually live with each other, and
no one's refusing to carry gear anymore, except for you can now do that. You're free to do that, as opposed to having a whole band of people that do not want to ever carry gear.
No, I didn't carry gear, but I was the singer.
I mean, but that lead singer trope that we don't carry gear.
Right. No, absolutely. I feel free to be myself, to dance in an effeminate fashion. I like the evolution of the band.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think it shows through in the record too. I think like we especially now that the band has been through so many changes and transitions, it was important to me to that the next release be something like more of a live, an example of what we sound like live, which I think it's hard to capture any bands live energy on a recorded, on a recording. And, we had a precedent with the Johnny's Bar Mitzvah thing, but I really think this record, the only thing that we're missing is just the sort of like a lot of applause, because on the record there's like maybe 5 people clapping at once or something like that. They're like
because
people,
they didn't like it.
because they did not like us. They didn't know it. None of them knew us. None of them knew who we were. Unlike Johnny's Bar Mitzvah, where like the kid was Mike's publicist's son or something like that. So some of the people knew what they were getting into.
Yeah.
And furthermore, they served mugs, like beer steins of wine. So by the time, by the second set, like people were like loose, they were drunk, salty drunk. And, but at this show, nobody knew who the hell we were. And, so it was hard to kind of like, and we told some off-color jokes. I think the uncles wanted to kick my ass, you said, CJ, they were kind of, and, but so we had to reel them back, which is exactly what our live shows, are supposed to be.
Well, it's like fitting for the type of band you are, that like, it's a type of band where you have to be prepared. Like, obviously you guys have a huge following out of the gate, but like for this type of band, you have to be prepared to go in to any situation, any room, and adapt to what that crowd wants. Like, I interviewed Jake Burns from Stiff Little Fingers, and he was talking about these like jukebox bands. I'm trying to remember what they used to call them in Northern Ireland, that they would go in. He's like, they were amazing. They could play any song. And they were going into sometimes really hostile rooms in Northern Ireland at that point, where no one was going out.
Yeah, that chicken wire up, like in the Blues
Show
Brothers.
bands?
Show bands, that's it. Yeah, right, exactly. And like how talented all these show bands were. And it's kind of like, I guess you guys are the all-star version of a show band, where you can have to go in and win a crowd.
Or lose them.
Yeah.
We've lost them before. PNC Park many years ago in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We lost as a stadium of 35,000 people, which to me right now, in hindsight, is a red badge of courage.
Oh, absolutely.
But
And you were asked not to come back the next day. You had 2 days.
we were. And so Kent had to negotiate 2 days pay rather than 1 day. We were supposed to play 3 nights, and they summarily...
But like, I know as like, in terms of I'm in a band, I want people to respond to what I'm doing level, it must have been disappointing. But on a punk rock level, that's the coolest shit that could have happened.
It was tough to go through because, like, so first of all, there's M1000s going off from the field, and luckily we were out of projectile range. Like, we were out at second base. But I grew up in that town, and had like a complicated childhood because of Pittsburghers too, and so that just like it was like being on acid without ever having taken acid. So when we went downstairs afterwards, they told us, like, you guys should probably hang out for 2-3 hours or something like that, just to like, so nobody's still around after, because people were really disgruntled because Barry Bonds was gone. So the Pirates were doing really poorly at the time. And the only thing that brought fans in from like Pittsburgh and out of town was fireworks night, and we ruined it. I think there was like an intifada going on at that time, and it still made the front page of like the local newspaper.
That's amazing. You're like Suicide. When Suicide played with the Clash and people rioted like that.
I heard about that, yes.
There's a rare achievement, and it's awesome because like it shows that this band, as accessible as what you're doing is, it's still punk. And they're still like, normal people aren't going to get it. And that's what makes it cool.
But it lampoons the notion of punk too, just by its very nature. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then I'm very happy to do that too, because I don't feel like the people that were punks before there was a name for it took it particularly seriously, or like until that UK 82 stuff, there wasn't a uniform or like a gang mentality or something to it. And it often feels like there is one these days. And it seems like it's sort of this like weird sort of like lowest common denominator race to the bottom, like an excuse to half-ass or an excuse to act like just a garden variety pig. You know what I mean? Like, that's at its worst, obviously. And I still love punk music and punk culture enough to make fun of it. And,
Well, that's why I think Pittsburgh and the stuff, especially in that first wave of Pittsburgh's punk is so interesting.
Like Car Sickness,
the Five, and Human Switchboard, something like that.
Remember
the Hank Band. I love
the Cardboards.
Stick
Against Stone.
Like there's just like this, because it's, and like you're saying, it's a hard town, and all the people I know from Pittsburgh will talk about how hard it was growing up and how much kind of like, the bad side of Deer Hunter they were dealing with in high school.
It didn't make me tough, but I took my lumps for sure. And a lot of people that grew up there, that around, like, especially in the 70s or 80s, and especially people that looked, punk or whatever it was really difficult.
But it made it like, if you're going to make this music, you might as well do it and make it as fucking weird as you can.
Yeah.
And it's already, and like, it's like...
And confrontational as you can. Because you're already getting beat up.
Yeah.
For no reason.
Yeah, it's like Warhol and the Penguins at the same time, right? Like, it's like... And that's what punk is, right? Like, it's like... And that's what I love when I think about the Ramones. How this is, like, baked into it from, like, the genesis point where you have always in punk... two polarities of a Joey and a Johnny.
Yeah.
And it's like, it goes back and forth and it fluctuates.
And a Dee who was a little bit of the both of them.
Yes. Also the TDs. And then there's also the Tommy, too.
Yeah.
And then there's also the CJs that kind of come in and like are like, okay, we got to do this. Let's make this work still.
Yeah.
And so it's like, in the Ramones, you see the whole thing laid out right there, right at the jump with these people. Definitely was kind of a formulaic thing going on that Tommy recognized. Tommy is really the guy who recognized. I mean, who in their right mind would have ever picked Joey as a front man? Mm-hmm. He wasn't conventionally good looking. He was at least a foot taller than everybody else in the room. Completely awkward. Was not a gifted speaker. But somehow Tommy managed to pick Joey as the front man of the Ramones, So the whole outsider thing is really born out of that. They thought they were going to be, they thought they would be to the Bay City Rollers what the Stones were to the Beatles. That they would just be like the evil Bay City Rollers. So poppy music and everything else. But like I said, Tommy really had some kind of genius going on there to pick Joey as the front man. But what you're saying is exactly true. It just encompassed all of the things that have lived on in punk rock over the years through a bunch of other bands. And even, like some punks will talk about how they got beat up by the jocks when they were in high school. But then you guys got guys that are huge, that are, big in the punk rock community. And when I talk to them, we don't talk about anything having to do with music. We talk about baseball. Yeah.
So that you have like even that conflict, even who really is a punk and who isn't, and who shouldn't be involved and who is. It all just kind of gets tossed up in the air and falls where it may. And that's what punk rock really is.
Yeah.
It's literally just doing it your way. Doing it your way, the way that you want to do it. That's always how I looked at punk rock.
And it's like, it also gave the kids, like, as much as like there were also bullies in punk rock, and there's this sort of thing that kind of constantly seems to happen where kids that were bullied all of a sudden have the power and they can kind of inflict that on kids in the punk scene or people outside like that. But excusing and ignoring that for a second, what punk also gave is people that were awkward like Joey, or were being beat up in their school, were like Mark Mothersbaugh was in Devo. It gave a pride in being uncool, and it completely turns it on its head, where all the cool kids are now the losers, and they don't know about the actual cool shit, and all the dorky kids are the ones that are part of the secret side. It's like the real Matrix.
Yeah, but and this might be getting a little psychologically deep, but the pit at punk shows, all that frustration that you felt from being picked on or made fun of or getting bottles thrown at you by a bunch of rednecks in a pickup truck or something, all that stuff you got to release when you were in the pit. Like, that was like, it was better than therapy. You know what I mean? Literally, you got into the pit and threw elbows at everybody else, and you got some of that out, So, and it was a place for kids generally that got pushed around a lot to get in the pit and get to be physical without any real serious threat of violence until until it got violent.
Until it got really
Yeah.
violent.
I was
gonna
fucking terrified.
And
always.
meanwhile, in San Diego,
Like, yeah.
because we talked about it.
We had a weird time period in New York where we had all these like kung fu guys who started showing up at the shows, especially like, matinees and stuff like that. And they would come in and from the first note, they would just start doing kung fu on everybody in the crowd. And it was so fun. That's kind of when I checked out, when I started going to hardcore shows. But it was a really weird thing to see. But it happened multiple times. It didn't matter if it was like the race of skinheads or the kung fu guys or, the football player guys who just realized we can go to these kids' shows and beat the shit out of them and they love it.
Yeah.
Well, and the response time is longer at a punk club, like for cops or
no one's going to call the
EMTs
cops.
or-
It's got,
Yeah.
and that's one of the darker sides of punk is that it's got this built-in aversion to authority. It's got kids that are sometimes looking for family coming from broken home situations.
That's a big one, too.
And it's a prime place for people to kind of like feed off this sort of secrecy and
I don't think it's specific to punk though. It's just underground stuff in general.
yeah, you're right.
In general,
You're right. Definitely. You see it because I did in wrestling, and you definitely see it in cannabis, and you see it in anything where there's a healthy distrust of authority, but also at the same time it can be obviously abused. And
Yeah.
by the same point, as the violence was, it's like California's just so different how punk happens there because I think it just got so much bigger than it did other places other than maybe Quebec.
Because LA is a fucking beast. That's why I think.
Yeah, and if you think about it though, like all the way up to like San Francisco, it's like solid bands in like every town from 79 until 85, and then it starts. Well, I guess it gets too violent, starts dying off in LA, and it changes everywhere. I guess a little bit, right?
Yeah, SF had some good bands, but it also seemed like as importantly to be like this, like the first far out of town show for a lot of SoCal bands to play up in North Beach at the MAB or the On Broadway or something like that in these legendary shows. And a lot of them were SoCal bands that would come up.
Yeah, and it's funny because like it's interesting how hardcore, and specifically the violence in hardcore, kind of like infects, I guess, or like it takes hold in each city. Like, and I'm not talking just like, you're talking about the healthy pit, but like when the real violence starts in LA, it's very much gang involved. In San Francisco, it's like sketchy
Skinheads.
Yes, weird
Peckerwoods that from like Texas or the Central Valley or something like that. They came, I went to a couple shows at the farm when I first moved out there, and those were really, really scary.
Yeah, but then in San Diego, it's completely different because it's like, well, I don't know. You talked about it last time you were on the show. It's
drugs too. Like bathroom meth. It's a big meth town. So people, you couldn't even take them down. They were so fucking out of their minds.
Yeah, and it's
Do you have jarheads coming to shows too, or like
those guys would get their asses beat in a second.
So it was like Nazi guys.
They weren't Nazis. They were like mostly like, Mexican American dudes. They were skinheads. It wasn't a racial thing. I think it was just more like a tough guy, badass thing.
licensed to beat the shit out of smaller, lesser in number?
We were easy pickings. At one point, I weighed 80 pounds. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Well, were there like a band that they would gather around? Like
no, because it was just shows. If there was something going on, that was where they would gather.
Yeah.
I don't know what bands they were even into. I don't know.
Yeah, because there wouldn't be. There's not really like that. I can't think of the hard skinhead San Diego band from that time period. About 5150.
No, they weren't. No, it would have been like smaller bands like Crabgrass. I don't even know if they have anything out. It's a band called The Insolents who were on Mystic.
Yes, who Milo from the Descendants joined.
Did he join them?
He played keyboards for him for
because they all went to UCSD.
Yeah. So he played keyboards for him for a hot minute.
Yeah, they kind of.
That's why.
As a kid, I don't know if this was my kind of experience. I thought that they were like kind of pretending to be punk on the weekends kind of thing. I'm sure they were really into it. But I gotta say, I don't even know what punk is. You know what I mean? Like, you have the show turned out a punk. How would you define?
Well, that's what I love about it. It's this religious thing that, like, if you went up to like a bunch of Christians, you're like, "What is Christianity?" They'd all give you like different interpretations of it. I think in the same way, it's like a secular ideology that we somehow feel is bigger than us in a way, because it stays with you. Like people talk about it well into their adulthood, which you don't really see other than people like, oh, I was a raver. Like, you know, and I'm sure there's hardcore fans of this, but like, I mean, I think en masse, like we're all damaged by this thing or changed by this thing.
Okay, I'm going to say some band names and you tell me if they're punk or not.
Yeah.
Is Television punk?
Absolutely.
Nope. Wrong.
Why do you say no?
Because they're not.
How come?
They're underground band. They're experimental. But I wouldn't say they're a punk band.
Was there a word punk at that time other than Lenny Kaye's
there is.
fucking?
There is.
I just don't think they were a punk band. I just think I don't think they wanted to be a part of that.
I think
the limitations of what that maybe meant.
Well, but that's the limitations that we put on it now. Post-hardcore, post like UK82, we put limitations on it. But when you look at that first wave, like you look at that first scene that Punk magazine was writing about, Lester Bangs, I think, used it first though in Cream. But
okay, Nirvana punk.
Yes,
I agree.
Yeah.
What about? Let's go back to New York. Talking Heads.
Yes.
No.
To a point. Because hey, you know what? You.
What about the Gun Club?
Yes. Definitely.
What about Elvis?
No.
You don't think Elvis was a punk?
No.
Totally bucks.
I'm a massive fan.
Totally bucks everything else going on.
What about the Seeds?
All his influences from black music, gives the middle finger to everything else going on. That's not punk.
It is, but it's like, because punk, I think, comes to me like that first punk scene is Cleveland, Ohio, when before like, you know, the Dead Boy, Frankenstein becomes the Dead Boys and moves to New York, and before all that stuff happens, where it's like a bunch of kids that are like, let's just do this. No one's going to fucking care, but we like the Stooges, we like the MC5, we like the Seeds, we like
Velvet Underground.
That's what I was going to ask. Are the Velvet Underground punk?
Proto-punk.
They'd
be proto.
Yeah, but in hindsight, like, given that you know what everybody knows about them, can you now say that they were a punk band? Like,
okay, but then you go like, is Mozart punk? Is Jerry Lee Lewis punk? You know, is all these?
Yeah, but they sounded kind of punk, right?
Jim Morrison,
a couple songs.
Jim Morrison was he?
Jim Morrison's proto-punk. Yeah,
the Kinks.
Iggy says that, right?
Massive influence on him.
Yeah. So I think the punk thing happens once that proto-punk thing happens and people realize, oh shit, no one cares about this stuff. This is not going to be successful. And instead of trying to be the Rolling Stones, all these kids were like, let's just be like these bands. Like, who cares if anyone likes it? Like, we like it. Like the Electric Eels. Like you're saying, the Ramones, like the path to success that eventually got carved by them defies all probability. Like more than Nirvana and Green Day. Like you're saying, Billy Joe Armstrong.
Those are all catchy songs.
They're catchy songs
in the first place, like outside of the context of.
But people didn't like catchy music at that point, right? Like it's Yes and it's ELO, and I know there's people still like listening to oldies radio or whatnot, but like prog was happening. Like it was an artistic act, but also a political act to be like, no, fuck all that. Let's strip it right back
Roots
down.
rock and roll, yeah.
And you also had the disco thing going on at the same time too. It was like they were so out of left field, didn't sound like anybody else. But you know, the cool thing is bringing up Television and Talking Heads and Blondie, Ramones. Can you imagine they all came from the same scene simultaneously, right?
Yeah.
The New York scene at that point, there was so much going on. All the artists that lived down there on the Lower East Side, all those bands. You still had a lot of like the almost like the beatnik culture or the hippie culture. You still had Abby Hoffman and all these people were still influencing that whole scene. And those bands, the four of them have nothing sonically in common, and they all came from the same scene. And that's the cool thing about New York in that time period. It's just funny to me that like. The Ramones are born out of that, and they go on to start a whole new style of music, right? They give birth to all kinds of bastard babies along the way. And then Blondie goes on to be a huge commercial hit. Talking Heads goes on to be a huge commercial hit. But, like, Television doesn't. Suicide doesn't. Like, there were some bands that didn't, but when you think of how different all those bands were and what supported that, what created that, was a really unique time period.
Oh, absolutely.
A really, absolutely unique time period. And I think it's Legs McNeil. I read an interview, and he was like, it was like we had New York City to ourselves. It was like our parents went out and we just had the run of the place because cops didn't even go down in the Lower East Side. They could do whatever the fuck they wanted to do. And with all that freedom, you had all that creativity. It was really, really cool.
Cheap space, right? Like it was, New York was bankrupt at the time, but it was still a draw to people from all over the world that wanted to like make their bones in a creative kind of endeavor and wanted to do new shit.
Yeah. I think, and like you're saying there, especially if you broaden it and have Suicide in there, Jane County in there, Dictators in there, Testers in there. Oh, yeah.
And realistically, the Dead Boys, although they're not from New York, they really became, New York became their home.
And if you look at that now, and then you look at all the different places, punk, be it post-punk, hardcore, all the different places it went, it's still that kind of like different mixes of these different bands. Obviously more aggression got added as time goes on and speed and different things, but like it's still like, are you arty? Are you going poppy?
Yeah.
Are you going tough rock and roll? Are you going like there's just like the color palette is completely laid out, and like you're saying, it's all there in that city at that same time. And then watching that as they tour, Patti Smith tours, spread, and you've just got like
Richard Hell and the Voidoids. I mean, there's so many other bands from that time period. It's just one of the things that still to this day, like giving tours at the Punk Rock Museum in Vegas, I talk about it. I just started mentioning it when I was there, and I never really gave that any real thought. And when I started thinking about it, I was like, damn, that really was a unique time period for all of that to happen in one place. But, the Ramones were... I think Danny Field said they were like the Johnny Appleseeds of the music industry. Every time they'd go out on tour, they'd leave a town, a new scene would start. A punk rock scene would start. Because kids would go to see the Ramones and go, I can fucking do that. I can do that. Whereas you go to see Led Zeppelin, you watch those guys play, you want to go home and fucking kill yourself if you're a musician because you ain't going to never do it, But they would go see the Ramones and be like, and especially as awkward as they looked, but, the image, they just hit so many of the right things.
They empowered people.
Yeah.
I can do this.
Yeah.
Or I want to do this.
Yeah.
I want to try.
Yeah.
And it also completely was a deception on the audience because it wasn't easy. Like, I think if you talk to any drummer, they'll be like, it's easier to play like John Bonham than it is Tommy Ramone.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
Because Tommy's got, and especially, and Johnny too, like they were all approaching.
Tommy's got a groovy beat, man. A groovy pocket.
And he wasn't even a drummer.
Yeah.
And I can't think of anyone who played like that before him.
No.
I think he invented that.
Yeah. And I think that's the trademark of truly classic great bands is when you hear something and you can't tell what the influences are. Or it's such a mashup of different things that it becomes its own thing.
Or like what was the Talking Heads? They said that they wanted to sound like a Motown band but couldn't. And that's why they were the Talking Heads.
Yeah.
I heard, one of my favorite things was that Jello said in that American Hardcore movie. It's just like everybody drained out from the podunk towns that they were in, all the Velvet Underground fans, and they moved to the bigger cities and got together and started what would become punk bands.
Yeah.
At least on the American side.
Like the Cramps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't they start in Ohio too and then make it in New York?
Yeah. Was it Ohio? Were they from?
Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio.
Yeah, because Miriam Lina was the drummer at first.
Yeah, Ohio boy.
And Homeboy was from.
It's weird.
Wasn't Nick Knox and the Electric Eels or something? Or
He did play with them, I think. Right?
Was that later on though? Or no,
I don't know.
But like you break it down, you've got that Cleveland scene, you've got Clone Records in Akron, you've got the Cramps coming out of it. Like punk, as much as it coalesces and becomes something in New York, it's like it's really like American kind of Midwest, and even Hamilton. We had Simply Saucer, and they're all
got back together.
You were talking about them last night,
and they're weirdly.
I don't know.
Thing that blows
Simply
my
Saucer.
Oh, they're amazing. Like they're same time period and but doing the same thing where they're trying to figure it out. Like what's this thing going to be that's coming, and making really weird space rock stuff.
Yeah, Velvets meets Hawkwind kind of.
Yeah. But they were
cool.
But it's crazy.
Good description.
But like Craig Bell from Rocks from the Tombs was pen pals with the guys from Simply Saucer because they met through a Sid Barrett fan club, and they knew Peter Lautner, who was friends with the Television guys because they were friends through music writing, and it's just like this network of people
all around the world too. When you go to like Australia and you look at the Saints and Radio Birdman, that are all doing.
The Saints barely had the Ramones.
Yeah.
Like they barely had the Ramones as an influence, right? Yeah. When Stranded came out, like they like
you heard that is it Kid Galahad, that stuff? It's like 70s.
There's Colored Balls too, and Lobby
the
Lloyd.
Saints, their first band.
It's interesting too because like that stuff that's happening in like they have their own protopunk that
Radio Birdman.
Well, and the Sharpie stuff, which are like the mullet mod, like Colored Balls and all that. That was like so. There's this. It's this energy like Dr. Feelgood in England that's happening kind of all around the world, and then it just in New York really with that scene really comes together and it's named, and that's where it becomes powerful, and it's still powerful to kids, right?
Yeah,
but there's no individuals. Like it's all like it's shit that comes.
I feel like that Australian stuff was like had more reason to be. I mean, government basically had outlawed.
Oh, task in Brisbane and the task force and all that shit. Yeah, it's like, and then also like when you talk to Jake and you find out like, we're the first kids allowed out after the Troubles. Like no kids were allowed out. There's like a lost generation of kids
in Northern Ireland.
Or you look at LA post Manson and kind of that 5 or 6 year period where they completely locked down youth culture, and then how they treated punk when it started, where the cops are busting up shows.
Yeah,
it really is born out of. Like you're saying, like you got the whole city of New York kind of like abandoned at this point by politicians. So let's just make something.
That was a thing that before I ever traveled to California that I didn't understand about a lot of the California punk and hardcore bands was why it was so political. Because I was never big with politics and music, and I could never understand it. And then I got stationed in San Diego with the Marine Corps. And I used to take a Greyhound up to Hollywood to go stay at my sister's on the weekend. The first time I take the Greyhound up, me and my sister get up the next morning after I get there, and we're going to get breakfast. So we cross the street. We get to the other side. A cop car comes wheeling up, pulls up next to the curb. I'm thinking like the store's getting robbed or something. So I back up against the wall. I push my sister, and the cops come up to me, and they're like, "Let me see your ID." And I was like, "What are you talking about? They're like, "Let me see your ID." So I pull out my military ID, and the cop's like, "We're going to give you a summons." I was like, "What are you giving me a summons for?" They were like, "You jaywalked." I didn't even know what the fuck the term meant. It don't even exist in New York, you know? But
because it's a walker's city.
But it occurred to me right then, this is what the kids are jumping up and down and yelling and screaming about.
Especially
the cops
in LA.
Are fucking pricks.
Yeah.
They were like they were pricks, you know. And it suddenly made sense to me. I was like, I get it. Now I get it. I seriously get it.
There are books about the LAPD and like everything that led up to the 65 Watts riots. And
yeah. But it's funny. That's like the back in the day, what did we have? We had fanzines to learn about bands from other scenes. I didn't travel when I was a kid. Nobody I knew traveled. The only way we learned about bands from the West Coast was through fanzines, generally, or if somebody's cousin came over and brought a record or something like that. But that was the first place I heard of any of those bands. And then, buy cassette tapes or singles or whatever. I think the first anything I ever bought from the West Coast was from the Weirdos. I think I got the first thing I ever bought was a Weirdo single. And I was like, oh, these guys are fucking cool. Not political, not at least from the first single that I heard, But then once I started hearing Black Flag and fucking Circle Jerks and the rest of them, I was like, man, these guys are political. They're really on the political tip. And I thought it was just influence from England. Mm-hmm. Like in my mind, I was like, they're more influenced by the English scene than they are by the New York scene. Until I went there. And I realized, no, they got something to be bitching about,
And in SF, well, the Dead Kennedys, the cover is the White Knight riots. Yeah. Like when Dan White got acquitted with the Twinkie defense or whatever that was. Mm-hmm. But I don't remember. I don't know that the SFPD was. I don't think they were as bad as LAPD. LAPD are famously bad. Like they militarized at some point in the 50s or the 60s, so they were just a hammer looking for a nail.
It was weird. It was definitely weird because in New York, literally, you could walk down the street smoking a joint, and cop would kick you in the ass and tell you get off my beat, and that would be it. You know what I mean? But it seemed like in LA, like they were just after the kids. And then after I started hanging around in LA and started hanging around with some of the skater kids, and they started telling me the shit that they went through, or just seeing them getting chased by cops and stuff, I was like, man, this is just a whole different scene out here, you know? Yeah. But it's the old thing, right? You travel the world, you learn more, you get more cultured, you understand things a little bit better. But I just never thought that New York and Los Angeles, or New York and San Francisco or San Diego would be that much different until I got out there, and I was like, it's a totally different culture. Totally different culture.
It's like, for me, the biggest culture shock that I've ever experienced in my life was the first time I was in New York, not the first time I was in England or Tokyo, or like, for me, that was eye-opening. It was also very exciting, you know. It's like that energy, it just kind of, you can't help but be inspired and moved by that.
Yeah.
But yeah, coming from San Diego, I feel like nothing could be more different, really. Yeah. You know?
There's almost been a flattening, cultural flattening that's gone on, where everywhere's kind of the same.
Yeah.
A little bit now.
The internet is really...
Yeah.
Accents are disappearing.
Yeah. But it's so fascinating when you look at this scene that's developing completely organically, completely removed from media kind of manipulation, I guess, or like playing these records on the radio, just how these scenes develop based on the environments they were in. So you look at like DC hardcore and how highly documented it is, and
yeah, they're a bunch of archivists, aren't they?
Yeah, but they were all like kids of politicians and teachers, and
they're really good at like saving all that.
They
stuff.
did. Yeah. They put value on their work right away, which is rare.
Aren't they chanting Georgetown punks on that Teen Idols 7-inch, man? Like, that's such a weird, like, Georgetown punk. What does that even mean, man? Like, that basically means you're like the kids of like ambassadors and like politicians and shit, right? Georgetown's super nice, right?
Yeah.
Like,
well, like SOA, Rollins' first band, used to practice in the vice president's residence.
Wow, I did not know.
No, I didn't know that either.
One of the guys, I think it's like the head of the Joint Chiefs, lives in the same residence as the vice president.
Fucking public defender is one of the best.
Oh, it's amazing.
Is it a hardcore song at that point, or is it still a punk song? And I was going to say Life of Crime, man. That's like, I think that's like a perfect punk song, if not the perfect, because you brought up the Weirdos, man. I love that song.
Oh, yeah. It's heavy.
Well, then it's interesting when it starts changing, like you're saying, is it punk or is it hardcore? And then at a certain point, hardcore hits everywhere. And it's like a wave, right? Like, you watch America's Hardcore, Rollins again is talking about going up to do that Teen Idols tour on the East Coast, or it was West Coast, sorry, seeing the kids in LA and being like, Georgetown's going to do this now. And they came back, brought it back, and brought that to Boston, the Boston kids, and they all went to New York and beat up all those homeless New York kids. Like, they were like homeless punk kids in New York at that point.
Not Harley Flanagan, though, man. I love that's one of my favorite scenes in American hardcore. Is just like how composed he is when he's telling that story too, and they're pushing him just because he stops.
Yeah,
you know, he doesn't tell the rest of the story. They kind of prod him, like, so what happened?
Yeah,
they got housed.
Yeah,
and I think he's talking about Dean.
What do you think happened?
They got housed. The hard rock attitude. I had never heard a hard rock attitude either. Oh, that was so good.
But it changed, like, you know, and I know they do eventually house them. Good, but that first couple times, those Boston kids came in. They were organized. They went in that pit. They beat up kids, you know. And but then that makes New York the hardest hardcore scene out of anywhere in the world, which completely changes hardcore again as everyone's looking to New York after.
Antidote are still one of the best bands to come out of that period, out of any fucking city, man.
Absolutely.
There was that 7-inch rules.
That and Abuse, like Urban Waste, and then Agnostic Front.
Yes,
like,
Victim in Pain is still a classic.
One thing also, I think we talked about
Cause for Alarm.
CJ, we talked about it last time too, where like the effect like hardcore, and I guess speed metal too, had on the Ramones, in particular Johnny, because there's like a point where the Ramones live, it's just faster and faster.
Yeah. You know, they hit, when they did End of the Century, that album was kind of their swan song for ever hoping to become a commercial success. That was it. Johnny had enough. He was like, you know, they told us if we work with Phil Spector, this will be the album that breaks us and blah, blah, blah. And I realized we were never going to be a commercial success. And that the kids who showed up most of the time at our shows were the hardcore kids. They were at every show, no matter what. They always used to come out for us. And that's who we were going to write our records for from now on. So it was actually a concerted effort by the band to start writing heavier, faster stuff. That's how Eat That Rat and Warthog and, Love Kills and all of those songs came about. That was kind of their farewell to the sweeter stuff. Joey, of course, continues to write some of the more commercial songs, but they recognized hardcore as the kind of like the next movement in punk rock, and they wanted to be part of that, and that's they kind of targeted that audience.
As a vocalist, though, it's frustrating when you're trying to fit the words into a song, and it's like way faster. And on Local Live, you really hear there's parts where he's like Blitzkrieg Bop, the Blitzkrieg Bop, you can't even fit it in because it's like so fast by that point. That was an issue when I was in the band, and I brought it up to John one time. I said, if we slow down just a little bit, Joey will be able to sing the melodies. I'll be able to sing the harmonies. We'll just sound better. We just got to slow it down a little bit. And John was like, nope, the kids like to come to our show to slam dance and have a good time. They don't care about melodies and harmonies and all that shit. We tried that a long time ago, and it didn't work. We played this fast because this is how the fans like it. And I couldn't argue with him.
It was probably a part of the dysfunction of the band too.
Oh, absolutely.
I was just
you.
Yeah,
absolutely. I for sure. And I said that. I said that to in an interview for, I think it was the documentary End of the Century, and I said, I felt like to a certain extent that Johnny was trying to push Joey off the edge because he didn't want to be the one to blink first.
So he
didn't be the one to say, "Hey, I had enough. Let's just get out."
Because I went for one of the greatest nights of my life, and I went for dinner with Johnny when I was in high school. My teacher was really good friends with him because of poster trading. Mike Orlando from Hollywood Canteen.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. He told me you guys used to go there after shows sometimes. Yep. And
bought a couple of things at his store.
He got us to go down there, and we didn't believe him. We're like, "There's no fucking way you know this guy." And then we get there, and all of a sudden Johnny came in, and he was awesome. Like, it was like a really good conversation. No one else in my class really cared about punk, but I just got to punch the shit out of him. And he answered all my questions, but he was like, "I'm never going to play music again." Do you think he would have done a band if it had happened earlier again?
He did. Well, me, Johnny, and Mark, there was talk about me, Johnny, and Mark going out and playing together as the Goons. That was, kind of like a talked about thing. When Joey died, Johnny called me up and he was like, "Well, that's it. The Ramones are over." He said, we're never going to be able to do anything, And then I think that the thing of me, him, and Marky doing the Goons thing got talked about a little bit, but eventually he let it go. And then he did do the recording with Slim Jim Phantom and Lemmy. He did what do they call it? I always want to say Hep Cat.
It's something Cat, right?
Yeah. He did that, but no, I don't think so. I think, he was very, very, had his way of doing things, and when the Ramones were done, he's like, "I'll never do anything as good as the Ramones, so why bother?"
It also, I interviewed Al Brill from SSD, and his kind of approach to guitar is very much I think in keeping with Johnny's, which I think is like a shift where it's like, I'm not a guitarist. This is my tool for this project, and I'm not going to sit fiddle and learn someone else's songs unless it's for this project. And I think that's something that kind of carries throughout punk afterwards.
Johnny's style, a lot of people think it's just all downpicking, but there is, if you really listen to what he's playing, there is a rhythm to what he's playing. He's not just, it's not just feeling. There's a little bit of rhythm to it. John does a really good job of playing that same kind of thing.
Yeah.
When we play together, he's got that feel you know. But it's not a common thing, you know. It's really not. Doing my solo project and having guys come out, you know, I've played with some, you know, really good guitar players that just couldn't get their head around, you know, what it should sound like.
Sped up English glam.
Yeah.
Like sometimes it sounds like that to me.
Yeah.
And it makes sense because that's probably what all those English punkers wouldn't admit to listening to. Like they'd admit to listening to like T-Rex and Bowie, but not like Mud.
Yeah.
Or that's one of my favorite rock and roll beats ever. And the punk beat is kind of just a sped up version of that.
Yeah.
And then also, like, I think the blues rock stuff, too, like Groundhogs and Them, obviously with Gloria and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's
Mystic
like that.
Eyes. That's pretty gnarly song.
There's a, I know, but it's interesting you say that about John, because I think Johnny and you, John, have completely different approaches to music. Like, I've seen you in so many different projects, and they're all awesome, and you're always, like, not afraid to, like, do a little something different. Like, it's a completely...
Very similar politics, though.
Well, he is I have lots of favorite guitar players, but if I had to pick one guitar player who was the biggest influence on me, it would definitely be Johnny.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. And it had more to do with not only listening to the records, I think I saw them on some TV show when I was a kid.
Okay, Motorhead.
Not
The
punk.
first record.
One of the best rock and roll bands of all time.
But is it punk?
No.
It's like
Parts of it are.
gold over
They gotta be.
No, I don't think
I was
so.
part of that scene. They just kind of get...
Yeah, I don't think
I don't know.
What's punk gold? Is it brass?
That doesn't mean I don't like it, by the way.
Oh, no. It's,
rusted.
I actually mean it as a compliment.
of course.
You know?
But is it punk? That's it.
It's just like Motorhead, AC/DC, the Ramones, 3 bands that existed only in their own scene.
But they were marketed as punk at kind of.
Right.
Because that was, a catchphrase.
Yep.
Some publicist somewhere.
Crossover, punks love AC/DC and Motorhead.
Yeah.
Motorhead fans are punks and metalheads, you know what I mean? It's like,
Sabbath,
there was
even though that was a little earlier.
It's but there's like so few bands that could really like kind of, cross over amongst all, I guess, heavy music. But those are like the 3 big ones.
Yeah. And again, bands that like were anti the notion of like that post psychedelia when it turned into progressive rock.
Yeah.
And the kind of grandiose arrangements and self-indulgence, and things were moving more and more away from rock and roll.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a shame, like a band like Dr. Feelgood who helped start it.
Yeah.
Ultimately kind of killed by punk.
Yeah.
I think, though, geographically it changes, too, because when we were in Australia last time, I went to Vicious Sloth. You gone to that store?
No.
Oh, it's the best record store in the world. It's crazy. But they had an Australian AC/DC poster from, I think it was like 76, like early 76.
Powerage? Was it
No, it's just like a poster for like a tour.
Right.
Or like a couple of shows, and it says 100% punk rock.
Yeah.
And it's in the black... it's in the Sex Pistols colors, like the pink, green.
Yeah,
And,
they're marketed as a punk band because that was what was popular.
and Lenny, you knew him way better than I ever got to meet him, but I always heard he said he'd prefer to be a punk band than a metal band, or he identified more with punk than the metal band.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's, like you're saying, Dr. Feelgood kind of gets wiped out a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think that's
and kind of the same thing with Eddie and Hot Rods, too.
Yeah. But if you talk to any of those people that were around at the time, they're like, oh, they were a part of this.
But they didn't wear the uniform.
Yes. Yeah. And that's like
And the Saints didn't wear the uniform.
Yeah.
A lot of other bands, they just didn't look at.
Australia, though, is better about respecting their musical heritage, I find.
Right.
Like,
They moved to England, though.
Yeah.
To make it.
That's true.
And then by that.
Yeah, Eternally Yours was England, right? Like
Melody Ward plays on.
Australia definitely is. They base a lot of their identity on their music.
Oh, yeah.
Australians, they are. Funny enough, I feel like Australia and the United States have a lot in common, right? Australia is, to me, well, back then when I first time I went over there was 1990, I think. I went there and I was like, this is like the United States in the 70s. Like literally, that's what Australia was like to me when I went there. It was like the rock and roll scene was so vital, and not like it didn't even sound like retro. It just sounded like rock and roll never went away, and it was just still steamrolling everything else. And the kids that were involved in the scene were unbelievable. All the kids that I met were so knowledgeable and like really loved all of the bands from there. And I got to meet and play with a bunch of really great bands from back then too, including like the Celibate Rifles and a whole bunch of really, really cool guys that I met along the way. But I identified so much with their scene because it reminded me so much of the scene in the States. And I think that's because, like, once you get outside the cities, you get into the smaller places, right? Back in the day in the States, if you were a kid that lived in a small town, your only shot at greatness, you had 3 routes. You could go into the military, you could be an athlete, or you could be, you know, a barroom hero and go and work a blue-collar job and go back to the bar after work and get bombed and go home and smack your wife around. Like, that was like the 3 possibilities. But rock and roll comes, and all of a sudden, all these kids in these little towns are suddenly driven to do something that will move them outside of the everyday life. And I think that dream, the way it kind of caught on in the 60s and the 70s in the States, it was the same exact way in Australia. So it just felt familiar to me with the first time I went there, the first time I went to Australia. But now it's much different. You know, now everything is so accessible. You can open up your computer, do a whole album in your bedroom and everything else. So it's changed a lot. But that spirit, that real like rock and roll spirit, it was so similar. What I felt in Australia to what I experienced in the United States. And that's why I've always kind of had a soft spot for Australia. That's why on my final tour in 2019, before I retired, I made my last tour in Australia and final show in Perth.
They like, I think there's like a more recognized continuity of music in Australia. Like people are like, okay, AC/DC, Birdman Saints, Nick Cave Bad Seeds, to scientists, but
like the Cramps and the Gun Club started a whole fucking thing in Australia that no other country would have been able to play that music convincingly because they're twisted, like fucked up hillbillies.
Yeah, like it's a whole country of Louisiana. It's like this thing that you don't really see as much in America. You see it in England too a little bit. Like they've got so much sort of like harkening back to, you know, the rock and roll time. But like you said, John, like unless you wore the uniform in America and Canada being kind of like, you know, the little brother a little bit in this way, you don't really get the accolades. There's not even like if you wore the uniform. It's just like certain bands are like picked to be like, okay, this was what that
But
was.
you're Anglophiles too, man. To have a West Coast band like DOA, they're not a West Coast band.
Yeah.
They're an English. They sound like an English band, even though they were like, they'd come down and play the MAB or go down to Los Angeles. Yeah. Even though they were a West Coast band, just because they were above this, you know, imaginary border, their sound was a lot different.
Yeah, and we had like, and that's why I think the Canadian punk stuff that happens, especially in that sort of first wave,
Subhumans.
Yeah, it's a lot more influenced by English stuff than North American stuff in a lot of ways, because we get those records in. They'd be imported here too, and there were record stores in Toronto that also had locations somewhere in the UK, so they would send records back and forth, and so I think it did inform the punk rock here. Like there's Steve Leckie from the Vile Tones, who would, you know, stab himself with pens, very much informed by like Iggy and what he's hearing about Sid Vicious. He said when he went down to CBGB's, he couldn't believe it. He's like, they're all arty, they're all well dressed, like it doesn't feel like this. This is pre-hardcore, obviously, but it was not really what he was looking for.
Yeah, because within the punk culture, there are all kinds of subculture. You know what I mean? Fashion was a part of the early punk scene. It absolutely was.
Oh, absolutely.
And image propulsion.
Yep.
And using, like, they didn't reject they rejected who the celebrities were, but they didn't reject those channels to celebrity. They just used them for their own purposes, I think.
But also in New York, the punk scene, the fashion scene, and the art scene all ran parallel to each other in New York. Like, if you think about it, Keith Haring and all these guys that go on to be the big guys from the 80s were all coming up in that time period, right? And then all the fashion designers that blow up really big later on in the late 70s and early 80s all came up in that same scene. You know what I mean? So those three scenes all were taking place in the same part of the city. And you look at footage from CBGB's, the earliest days, you look who's in the audience. That's who it is. Mm-hmm. It's all these, fashionistas and
Andy Warhol, like...
Yeah, that's who you see in the audience because that was the community that went to the shows. It wasn't kids coming in from the suburbs yet. It was still, very, okay, here's our little thing that we're doing here. Oh, yeah, I'm going to put a show on, come out for this, come out for that, blah, blah. And they all supported each other. Other scenes were totally anti-fashion. Like, when I first started going to shows, if you wore a T-shirt with a band on it, that was the most unfucking cool thing you could do. To buy a shirt with a band on it, it was like, what, are you kidding me, So, even within, the outsiders, there's outsiders of the outsiders, you know what I mean? There's so many different things going on in the punk and hardcore scene that seem to contradict each other, but they're still part of the same scene.
And it evolves and devolves into I don't feel and I don't know because I was still in single digits, but original punkers didn't collectively reject notions like class and respect the way a lot of later people did. That kind of race to the bottom I was talking about earlier. And sociopaths that I don't feel that would, arty fucking, fashionista, that style was important.
Yeah.
And even if you wear board shorts and a fucking Volcom hat, it's still a stylistic decision. Not one that I agree with, but you're still making a decision. There's no more realness to your look if you're playing like that. It's just that you're half-assing.
Yeah.
And you have a whole subculture that or at least half of it that condones and cosigns you half-assing because that means I get to half-ass too.
Yeah. Well, but I think California is where that changes, right? Because California, when you look at Black Flag, you look at Descendants especially, they just dress like normal people.
Schlubs, yeah.
And that becomes, I think...
But I still love those bands, but I hate...
You think they would be better if they dressed like Rocket?
Well, I think Black Flag had definitely a look. I mean, what you're talking about, it's the fucking dolphin shorts with no...
But Bill...
Yeah.
But that was 100...
And Greg Ginn always with the button-up shirt, I mean, I thought it was a look. I thought they looked cool.
But that was...
into it.
But that was born out of practicality, right? They're not...
Well, yeah.
They're not buying docks or bondage pants and being oh, this is going to be functional.
Dude was barefoot.
Yeah, that's true. The barefoot thing's a little weird, but he kept that going.
But even that, as more refined as, say, a dude with spikes and an expensive leather jacket and everything like that, it's still, you look like 90% of the other people that are playing your style of music at that time. Yeah. And so it's, I don't know.
As much as I used to, I didn't like the colored mohawks and the jackets all adorned and the bondage gear and everything. I couldn't relate to that. I was like, okay, you want to stand out the way you look, blah, blah, blah. But it was so easy to like the Ramones style from the beginning because that's what I grew up wearing. High tops jeans and a t-shirt.
Great style.
You know what I mean?
Great uniform.
And it was so easy to identify with them from jump. You know what I mean? And then everything in their music was just, to me, like an amalgamation of all the stuff I liked about rock and roll, like the early rock and roll stuff, because I'm lucky enough to have grown up listening to a lot of the early rock and roll stuff. And there was already parts of it that I heard when I was younger that I just loved, And the Ramones were doing that just really fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was so easy to like.
Surfy stuff, too, but on the East Coast.
Yeah. Yeah, but I felt like in punk rock, like at least from North America, most of the kids are dressed like they did normally on the street. Like,
Right.
you didn't have stage clothes, you know? It wasn't until later on when I started playing in bands and I got hooked by this band to play with them, and I did the whole spandex thing and all of that. I went through that whole hair metal time period, dressing up like that. And it always felt so weird. It was like so fucking bizarre to me. But I was like, all right, this is what these guys do. That's what I'm all in. In for a penny, in for a pound, you know? But it's it's funny because the high tops and jeans and t-shirt thing, it's the one look that never became uncool or went away.
No.
Like literally.
Yeah. And I feel like if you look at the Ramones as being this conceptually brilliant art piece, like on the same way people look at Devo.
Yeah.
Where they're like, I've always heard the story that Johnny went and saw the Dogs from Detroit play, and they were wearing their street clothes on stage, and this is the height of the kind of the glam era. And he's like, all right, that's a good idea. And then like the way they approach the music being something completely unique, the aesthetic of it, the visual, like it is like Devo. It's not coming in as like, oh, there's some weird schlubs. Like that was all an act.
Yeah.
Like, that was all shtick.
Yeah, but it comes off as very casual and natural.
Yeah.
But it's like they've got a designer working with them. Like Arturo's like right there, right? Like everything is so. It's like it's so much more of a deeper band.
But as a kid, through that lens, it just kind of looked similar to Sid and Marty Krofft in a very familiar way too. That I liked. That was like, oh, this is cool. I like that stuff, and I like this stuff too.
Yeah.
It's funny you say that because, like, now that you say it, I'm thinking about that Don Kirshner's Rock Pile and what you said about Joey being too tall, and it is this sort of like Yo Gabba Gabba, but like, but more Sid and Marty Krofft, I guess, for the era, like, kind of feel to it where it's like it is so surreal.
Yeah,
and this has been unbelievably surreal, and I wish you guys could stay all day. Anytime you want to come to my basement, please come back.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, thank you so
and
much.
bullshitting with us.
Oh.
I hope you like our new record.
Thank you, John, CJ, and Spike for coming back to the show, and hopefully they will return again, maybe to my basement. How sick was that? Huge thank you to Melanie and Eric for making this all happen, facilitating everything about this thing. Very much appreciated. Check out that new Me First and the Gimme Gimmes record. I'm excited to hear this. June 14th on Fat Records. And that's I don't really say what's on the next episode right now. We got the punk rock bowling episode coming out on Friday. I don't want to say what it is, but it's fucking awesome. You're gonna think it's cool. Okay, I got nothing else to ramble on about. That's it for today's show. Remember, as always, Black Lives Matter. The lives and issues faced by Indigenous peoples all over the world matter. We need to protect trans kids and help trans people protect themselves and their rights and stop hate and violence towards people of different races, different faiths, different nationalities, different sexualities, because we're not talking about politics here. This is just human rights shit. Ceasefires, basic human rights shit. The right to choose what you want to do with your reproductive system, basic human rights shit. So if there's organizations in your community that are affecting positive change and trying to resist the bullshit that's happening, there's no other way to put it. The fuckery that's happening on many fronts right now, get involved. Donate your time, donate money if you can spare it. I'm sure they could use some of that stuff. But you'll feel better about the state of the world. Maybe not better, but you'll feel like you're I guess doing something. Speaking of doing something, anyone can do this punk shit. Start a band, start a fanzine. Maybe it's a podcast. But this gets better when you contribute to it. And it gets more exciting the more people are taking it in different places. That's my view of it. So go and do something. Speaking of going and do something, sign that organ donor card. Because I've seen it perform miracles with my own eyes. Not in the room, but in the aftermath. I've seen the miracle happen. Finally, Yeah, if you're so inclined, try meditating. I'm certainly not the first person to tell you about this, and I probably won't be the last person to tell you about it, but try it. It does work, and if you remember to do it, keep up with it, because that's the hard part I'm finding. But all right, that's it for me. I have nothing else to talk to you about. Thank you for listening. See you on the next episode. It's punk rock bowling time. That's right, for the 24th year. One of the greatest festivals on earth, in my opinion, returns to downtown Las Vegas the weekend of May 25th, 26th, and 27th. I have had some of my greatest times playing this thing and just hanging out at this thing. You want to know how much this festival speaks to Turn Out a Punk's mindset? The headliners are Devo, Descendants, and Madness. Every day of this festival, the lineup is stacked with amazing bands of all types and stripes of punk and hardcore from all different eras, from ska to post-hardcore. We're talking like Bratmobile to Rock from the Crypt to Stiff Little Fingers to the Cosmic Psychos to Scowl to Chat. And then there's also all these late night after shows which are happening, and you wouldn't believe the lineup of these things, from the Zeros to Agnostic Front and everything in between. This festival is out of control for fans of punk. So I hope I will see you there, because this isn't like some sort of festival that you just go to and the bands are secluded in some sort of backstage area. Bands and fans and just punks alike are all just taking over downtown Las Vegas. So you turn around and all of a sudden you're gambling beside John Doe from X. I don't know if John Doe gambles, but if you turn around on the buffet line, you'll probably see me. And you better believe we're going to be talking about punk music. And because this festival loves this podcast as much as this podcast loves this festival, Punk Rock Bowling is bringing you a series of special episodes. So each and every week, I will have an episode going up featuring someone that's playing this festival. And hot damn, are there some good ones coming. Head over to punkrockbowling.com and hopefully I see you in downtown Las Vegas, May 25th, 26th, and 27th.